Rain hammered Wallace hard enough to turn the alley behind Cedar Street into a shallow sluice, and the woman in the boarding house kitchen flinched when the first earthworm slid out from under the door. Then a second, and a chain of them, pale and writhing, climbing over one another as if the floor were a river. She jammed a towel at the threshold. It soaked through in minutes. By evening, the stories had multiplied. Worms in basements, worms in pantries, a wriggling paste around chair legs, the meat counter at a grocer filmed with slick trails that smelled like wet dirt. Someone said a barrel had burst behind a warehouse up the hill, something sharp and chemical that bled into the rainwater. By morning, the sun burned through, the worms were gone or dead, and a cleaning rag left on a doorstep was etched with strange white blotches where the stain had lifted like lye. That's the story as it's told. The worm invasion, set sometime in the 1920s, an episode that doesn't appear in county ledgers but survives in what people swear they saw. It flourished in a town built on ore. Wallace, Idaho, sat tight in the Silver Valley, the seat of a mining district that pulled lead, zinc, silver, and the town's luck out of the hills for generations. Sluices and concentrators lined the creeks, rail spurs walked into canyons, smelter stacks along the valley east and west breathed metals into wind that never asked who stood downwind. When you live with tailings underfoot, the idea that a spill could drive creatures out of the ground feels less like a tale and more like a Tuesday. The part that bends the ear is scale. Thousands of worms at once, crossing thresholds as if pushed. Start with what can be documented. By the 1910s and 1920s, the Coeur d'Alene mining district around Wallace was one of the most productive in the country. Processing and smelting scattered metals through soil and streams, a historical fact that would cast a shadow across the century, through lawsuits, federal cleanup orders, and a lingering identity as a place where extraction built wealth and left a residue people had to live with. Decades later, residents would still be arguing with the government over how to measure harm and how to fix it. An entire Superfund site grew out of that argument, and Wallace responded with a bit of gallows humor. A mayor declared a downtown manhole cover the center of the universe, a jab at federal probabilism used to draw cleanup boundaries that locals thought too broad. The joke worked because it was based in a long, gritty familiarity with contamination maps and the mud they described. Wikipedia. After the mines came lawsuits that read like a ledger of consequences. One family, for instance, moved into a home near Wallace and later learned the yard soil held heavy metals from a century of mining and milling. They sued, and the region's newspapers covered the case as one more chapter in a valley where the past stained the present. None of that proves a worm flood in the 1920s. It proves what the ground carried and how often harm traveled from tailing pile to front porch. Spokesman review. So what would make worms leave the soil en masse? Any old-timer with a garden can give the short answer: water and trouble. Heavy rain drives worms up when the pores in the soil fill and oxygen drops. They surface to breathe and move. Trouble, sudden changes in pH or an irritant in the water, can do the same, pushing them up and out in a hurry. On streets with poor drainage, basements take the brunt. A tight, wet town like Wallace, hemmed in by slopes and built in layers of fill, would have given them few safe places to go except across floors and around chair legs. That's the mechanism. The mystery in the Wallace tale is the trigger. Floodwater alone or something carried in it. The chemical spill detail is the part people lean toward and away from in the same breath. The district handled acids, flotation reagents, and concentrates. Leaks happened. If a barrel ruptured and acids rode the runoff downhill, it could have changed soil conditions fast enough to send invertebrates looking for air. At the same time, acid strong enough to burn rag and skin would kill as much as it drove out, and worms are not noted for staging orderly retreats. The version told in town sounds like a hybrid: stormwater, a spill, and a town built across creek fans that turn into shallow rivers in an hour. What we don't have is a contemporaneous clip, no 1920s front page with a headline about worms invade Wallace, no county health report recording a specific spill that lined up with a night of slimed walls. The newspapers that survived the fires and floods of that era covered mine strikes, disasters, and oddities in the region with vigor. The absence here matters. It doesn't kill the story. It limits it. That means the only responsible way to tell it is as an investigation into a town's lived environment, a community that knew metals in the soil, saw their own basements through floodwater, and built a legend at the place where those truths met a wet night and 1,000 wriggling bodies. The setting helps explain the persistence of the tale. Wallace's streets curl along the south fork of the Coeur d'Alene and up tight-side canyons. Basements are common, and so is water that rises. The Great Fire of 1910 had already taught the town how quickly a wall of something could roar down a grade and make memory out of structures. In that frame, a story about worms is not a joke. It's an index of vulnerability. It says, if the ground itself revolts, what chance does a pantry shelf have? The 1920s were also years when chemistry came home from the war and marched into industry. Frothers and collectors, pine oil, xanthates, the alphabet soup of flotation, moved through mills. Rail yards held drums. Sheds held more. A burst, a tilt, a failed bung, and the contents of a barrel would join the week's storm and obey gravity. Whether that's what happened on the night Wallace remembers is unproven. That it could happen in a mining town is not in doubt. The way the story is told shifts with the teller. One version has worms pouring down stairs, another has slime on the meat counter at a grocer 2 blocks from the depot. A boarding house cook remembers worms in the oven, which says more about disgust than precise hydraulics. What doesn't change is the pairing of excess and immediacy. There were too many of them, and they were everywhere. The punchline is always practical, too. By the next morning, men were out with brooms and lye, women boiled rags, and the town smelled like a garden after rain. Even if the invasion itself can't be stamped with a date and a lab report, the cleanup fights that followed in later decades are well recorded and point straight back to the same friction between industry and home. Locals pressed companies and the federal government to clean yards and creeks. Governments issued maps thick with shaded polygons and estimates. When the Environmental Protection Agency widened the Coeur d'Alene Basin Superfund site far beyond the original smelter footprint, Wallace pushed back with pageantry and protest, a bit of comic relief for a very real economic wound. That argument is in the minutes and the court filings. It puts a backbone under the older worm tale. Here, messes don't stay theoretical. They end up in the sink. Wikipedia +1. In the end, the worm invasion functions the way a lot of mining town stories do. It begins with a scene so vivid you can smell it. It moves through a landscape shaped by extraction, where floods and spills follow the same paths downhill, and where the animals underfoot answer faster and more honestly than people with clipboards. It finishes with neighbors on stoops comparing notes and deciding how to clean, because no matter where the mess started, the mop ends up in their hands. That arc is true even if the numbers, thousands, everywhere, are glossed by time and disgust. If you press for a verdict, the file reads like this: proven. Wallace lived for a century with metals in its soil and water, enough to become the focus of one of the West's largest cleanups. Proven. Heavy rain can drive earthworms above ground, and irritants can accelerate the rush. Plausible. A 1920s storm combined with a small spill could have made a memorable night. Unproven. A specific incident of thousands of worms tied to a documented chemical release in that decade. The story doesn't fail that test. It simply lands in the bin-marked community memory, where people store the things that felt most true when they were up to their ankles in it. The house on Cedar Street is gone now, remodeled twice over. The alley still turns into a sluice after a big storm. You can walk down there on a September evening and smell the mix of creosote and wet dust and coal smoke that always seems to hang back in these hills. If you ask, someone will point to a doorway and tell you about the night the ground walked inside and tried to eat supper. Whether the worms came to breathe or to flee, the lesson reads the same. Design with the land in mind. Know what's in the barrels above you, and never imagine gravity will keep your secrets. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.